Hello, YouTube, and welcome to another edition of Take It or Leave It Commentaries. Today we're going to be looking at the 1975 film Jaws from Steven Spielberg. It's one of my favorites, as a matter of fact. This is an audio commentary, not a video commentary for copyright reasons as usual. But if you have a copy of Jaws and would like to follow it along, just move your copy to the Universal logo and press play now. This was Steven Spielberg's breakout film. If you're watching this, I assume you already know what kind of a troubled production history Jaws had. The filming was just a complete nightmare. The shark didn't work, which we'll get into as the film goes along. But also they were writing and rewriting the script during the day and in the evenings as they were filming, changing scenes around. It was always on the verge of becoming a complete disaster, and Spielberg always thought he was about to be fired, and so did everyone else apparently. So he deserves all the credit for the fact that it turned out to be a classic. And here during the opening, we hear the John Williams theme for the shark. It seems like any time there's a movie from the 70s or 80s where there's a memorable film theme, it's always got John Williams' name on it. He's just a complete genius when it comes to this sort of stuff. And this movie would not be what it was without that theme. When he first played the theme he had in mind for the shark, when Williams did it for Spielberg thought he was joking because it was just a few notes, but it didn't take him long to realize kind of what Williams had in mind, and that it was perfect for really what the film became because of the changes Spielberg had to make regarding the shark not working. And this is Martha's Vineyard here with the kids on the beach. Most of the film, of course, was made at Martha's Vineyard, and there's a couple of videos on YouTube, as a matter of fact, where they've gone and tracked down these locations, not just the homes and the buildings, but the stretches of beach and other locations they used for the film, and basically everything looks pretty much the same. It's identical to this day. It shows Martha's Vineyard's done a good job of keeping their town looking the way they want it to. But if you have any interest, look those up. They're really good. The name of the character of the boy that's trying to pick up Chrissy here is never mentioned in the film, but his name is Cassidy. He's played by a Martha's Vineyard local named Jonathan Philly. I looked him up, actually, and he doesn't have a lot of acting credits. He apparently wanted to be an actor, but he does have quite a few producing credits, so he's apparently stayed in the business after this. And Susan Backline plays Chrissy. There were a lot of locals used to fill in the parts. Really, the only roles filled by Hollywood actors are kind of the main roles, like the sheriff, obviously, and the mayor, and Richard Dreyfuss, and the parts like that. Everyone else is basically a Martha's Vineyard local, and I think that helps tremendously in giving the movie a genuine, authentic feel that helps it along. And here you already see some of the changes. Spielberg's original idea for the movie was to have it be basically a monster movie from the very beginning, where you would see at least glimpses of the shark from the first scene on. But once he realized the shark wasn't going to work, he had to rethink his original plan. And according to Spielberg, what he thought was, well, how would Alfred Hitchcock have made this movie? And that's where he came up with the idea of implying the shark, using the music and using those shots, which are still terrifying, of showing beneath people's legs and capitalizing on that fear of the unknown and not knowing what's beneath you. anyone that's seen this movie still thinks about it anytime they go in the ocean and are swimming around, and just that idea that you don't know what might be down there beneath you. It never goes away. Susan Backline was injured during this sequence. She had some damage to her ribs from the people below her. They had wires tied to her legs and were jerking her in different directions to simulate the shark attack, and apparently were a bit overzealous in the way they did it. And she did some dubbing work afterwards. All her screams and pleading to God, which I think is very effective, were done after production had wrapped. And what they did was they got her in the studio and just poured water into her mouth while she screamed. And to quote Richard Dreyfuss, that's also known as waterboarding. That's Steven Spielberg's dog, by the way, on the Brody's bed. The Brody's house, by the way, is another real location in Martha's Vineyard, but I've never known for sure if they use the same location for the inside of the Brody house and the outside. A lot of times what movies will do is they use one location for outside shots and then another for inside. As far as I know, it's the same inside and outside, but I don't know for sure. The casting for this movie was interesting as well. Roy Scheider got the job almost on accident. Spielberg was having a hard time casting his lead here, Sheriff Brody, and he happened to be at a party with Roy Scheider, and he was venting to him about all the trouble he was having finding someone, and Roy Scheider basically said, well, what about me? And that's how he got the job. Apparently Charlton Heston was interested in playing the part of Brody, but Spielberg, I think correctly, thought that would take away from the authenticity of the film and from the story itself. It would basically become Charlton Heston versus the shark, and he definitely made the right decision in not going in that direction. He's never really said who else he really considered for Brody, but I'm sure it's a long list. But I think Roy Scheider does an excellent job here. He's believable not just as Sheriff Brody, but as a former New York cop. Hard-edged, but still an everyman type guy that you like right off the bat. Of course, Roy Scheider may have regretted later that he got the job. As I already mentioned, this shoot for the first movie was a nightmare, and Roy Scheider did not have any interest in doing a sequel, but was obligated to appear in Jaws 2, and from everything I've heard, hated every minute of it. So I think getting the job on Jaws was a mixed blessing. And here's kind of our first look at Deputy Hendricks, who's played by Jeffrey Kramer. Jeffrey Kramer's in Halloween 2, by the way, in case you've ever seen that. He plays the coroner that tries to figure out if the guy with the Michael Myers mask that gets hit in the street by a car is the right age for being the real Michael Myers, and when they determine that he's not. I think they finally figure out that kid is Ben Tramer. And the movie follows closely along in most parts to the book. The book came out in 1974. It was written by Peter Benchley, and it's a good read. It's a fast read. It's very enjoyable. That's why Zanuck and Brown decided to make the movie. They both read the book, and they said later if they had read the book twice, they probably would have thought, you know what, we don't want to make this, because it would have occurred to them that it was going to be awfully hard to pull off. But thankfully for for everyone, they didn't do that. Brody's secretary here is played by another local. There he is using a typewriter, which of course, is no one uses a typewriter anymore. And what they've done here with the character of Brody, which is also different from the book, and I'll be mentioning the book as the film goes along. I've read it several times. As I said, it's a good book. But in the book, Brody has basically lived in Amity his entire life, and he's been the sheriff for quite a while. Here, they've changed that to Brody being a former New York policeman and coming to Amity, obviously looking for some peace and quiet in his life, and not the constant rapes and murders you deal with in New York. He wanted a job where he could actually make some sort of a difference. But the advantage in making Brody kind of new to the town is that Mayor Vaughn and some other people in town have to explain to Brody why the shark is so damaging to the economy of the town, and by explaining it to Brody, they explain it to the audience. That explanation of how Amity's economy works and the problems that the shark could cause as far as that goes in the book is all just exposition from the author with background information. Can't do that in the film. You have to have people talk about it. So that's a good way to explain that to the audience. And as I mentioned, all these locations here are still in Martha's Vineyard and are still 100% recognizable. Murray Hamilton is another perfect casting here. He was apparently the first person cast. Spielberg thought he had a very Richard Nixon type feel. And we saw Carl Gottlieb, who is one of the screenwriters for the movie. We saw him walk out of an office that is identified as the Amity Gazette, and his character here is a little bit muddled in the movie. It's really my only minor criticism in that he's not necessary for this scene right here. It's not immediately obvious that he was the one coming out of the Amity Gazette, or that the building he was walking out of is the Amity Gazette. So here, unless you were watching really closely, it seems like he works for the mayor in some capacity here, instead of being a newspaper man. And I think it would be more obvious that Meadows is a newspaper person if he wasn't in this scene here on the ferry at all, and it was just someone working for the mayor. There's some other scenes where Meadows does need to act as a newspaper person, but it makes his role more obvious. The local coroner here again is another Martha's Vineyard resident. In the book, Meadows is a morbidly obese guy. He's a major character in the novel. He's usually shown stuffing his face with a lot of food. But part of his role in running the newspaper is to do the same thing that the mayor is trying to do, which is protect the town from any sort of issues that will damage the economy. So he's got a bit of a tense relationship with Brody, even though they're friends. Their interests don't always line up. And here we have doomed Alex Kintner. Lee Fierro, by the way, plays Mrs. Kintner, and Jeffrey Voorhees, no relation to Jason Voorhees, plays Alex Kintner. There's a story I've read in one of the many books that I have. I don't remember which one off the top of my head, about the making of Jaws and the aftermath of what the movie meant for the film industry. But Lee Fierro, I guess, moved away from Martha's Vineyard later on and was back in town. and went to a restaurant and was eating lunch, and the menu had some references to Jaws on the items they had, and she made a comment to the waiter that she had played Mrs. Kittner in Jaws, and kind of laughed about it. And the waiter said, "Well, hang on one second." And when he came back, he actually had Jeffrey Voorhees with him. As it ended up, Jeffrey Voorhees owned the restaurant where she was eating, and she had no idea, hadn't seen him for decades, I'm assuming. I thought that was kind of funny. And these are good shots here, the people passing back and forth in front of Sheriff Brody as he's keeping an eye on things, and as the camera kind of gets closer and closer to him. And this is important for his character too. I mean, he's been cut off with the trying to make Chrissy's death look like it might have been a boating accident, but he's not buying that. He's still on the beach trying to do his job, despite the fact that he hates the water. As we're about to find out, he's got a fear of the water, and that's in the book too. But they don't make a big deal of it. It's kind of just a reference that Benchley threw in fairly late in the novel, and doesn't really seem to have much to do with Brody's character or what he's up against. They make a much bigger deal out of Brody's fear of the water here in the movie. The scene here with Alex is another scene where they were going to show the shark for the attack. And I've seen pictures where once they did get the shark kind of semi-working the way they wanted toward the end of production, they went back and tried to do this again so that you would get a pretty good glimpse of the shark when it attacks Alex Kintner. But I'm a dog lover, by the way. I just can't stand the fact that they imply that the dog is also a victim of the shark. That always bothers me. Here we have some more shots of the legs. But I don't know if they filmed the entire sequence and used the mechanical shark, but then in post-production and editing, they decided it worked better without seeing the shark, or if they decided that as they were filming and just said, you know what, it's better the way it was, so let's just leave it. That's really ghastly, all that blood coming up and seeing the kid get dragged under. And there, of course, is the famous zoom in there on Brody. And this is good too. As a parent, this is exactly what you would do. You're not worried so much about what's in the water. You just want to get your kid. And beyond swimming, I mean, I don't really have a fear of swimming in the ocean. I don't like swimming in lakes. Just, you know, there's always slimy stuff and snakes and things like that in lakes. I don't go in lakes if I can possibly avoid it. Swimming in the ocean for some reason doesn't really bother me. I guess because I don't know, it just seems cleaner and more natural to me. But I think much more about, you know, geez, I hope a shark's not down there about to eat me when I'm on a raft, more than when I'm swimming around, because of what we just saw, the legs kind of dangling down from that raft. I actually saw this film in the theater. I was 3 years old in 1975. So I doubt I saw it when it was first released. I'm assuming it was during a re-release, because I actually have some vague memories of this. Mostly I remember my mother, and I'm not, this is not a joke, but I remember my mother holding her hands over my eyes at certain points. And she's mentioned holding her hands over my eyes since then. But it's obviously one of my very, very, very early memories, is seeing Jaws in a theater. I wish I remember more about it, but when you're, 4 or 5 years old, that's about as good as your memory is going to get. There's a scene, well, we're already in the scene, but we're about to meet Quint here in a few moments. Spielberg considered a few different people for Quint before Robert Shaw got the job. His first choice was Lee Marvin, who it's easy to understand why. I think Lee Marvin would have been a good choice. But Lee Marvin wanted to go fishing for real and didn't want to be involved. The next option was Sterling Hayden, which I think would have been a strong choice too. But Sterling Hayden wanted the role, but had some tax issues that prevented him, for some reason, from doing it. That's how they eventually got to Robert Shaw, who had worked with Zanuck and Brown on The Sting. And here we have the closing the beaches thing. But Robert Shaw had his own tax problems. He was somehow able to get around those for the sake of the movie, but I'm glad. I don't think anyone could have done this any better than Robert Shaw. And what's criminal, in my opinion, is that Robert Shaw was not only did he not win a Best Supporting Actor Oscar, he wasn't even nominated. That makes no sense. I think Robert Shaw's performance here is kind of what Val Kilmer's performance in Tombstone is, which it just takes the movie to a whole nother level. Without Val Kilmer as Doc Holliday in Tombstone, I don't think that movie would be remembered the way it is. And without Robert Shaw, I think Jaws still would have been a very successful, very good movie, but he just takes it up a notch. There's a different scene where we first meet Quint, which is kind of an odd scene. It's a deleted scene where Robert Shaw, as Quint, is in a music store, and there's a young kid playing some sort of an instrument, and Robert Shaw kind of bullies him a little bit, just making noise at him. It's really strange because you don't know what exactly they're trying to tell you about Quint's character, except maybe that he's an asshole, or that he's just eccentric or strange. But this works much better. This is really one of the best introductions of a character, I think, in any movie ever. A lot of the references Robert Shaw uses, by the way, for sharks, with the Tommy Cods and porkers and all the references he makes to sharks and fishing, come from a local guy who plays Ben Gardner in the movie, Craig Kingsbury. He was about as close to a real-life Quint as there was in Martha's Vineyard, and Robert Shaw spent some time with him just picking up little nuances in the way he behaved and the words he used. So a lot of that comes directly from Kingsbury that you'll see a little later. This is something I've always wondered about as well, as he's looking through this book, Sheriff Brody, if they were able to use the shark throughout the movie, as was the original plan. Again, Spielberg originally had something along the lines of Godzilla in mind when he was planning the movie. I don't know if they would have had this part here with Brody looking through the book and looking at the pictures of sharks. That would have been kind of redundant. The reason, in my opinion, this scene works with him looking through these textbooks is that we haven't seen the shark, and it gives the audience an idea of what's out there and what's doing that to these people. But if we're actually seeing it, you don't really need these pictures and these reference photos. So I don't know if this is something that they added because they weren't using the shark or what. I think it's easy to see that they would have had Scheider looking through the photos and just kind of left it at that, because it makes sense that he would want to be researching the shark because he's not going to know anything about him. But as far as spending so much time on individual photographs and showing the damage they've done to people and the size of the sharks and all that, I don't think they needed that. But it's easy to imagine they go back and kind of fill those in. Lorraine Gary was a good choice for Brody's wife. She doesn't have a huge part in the film, but she's completely realistic as Brody's wife and as the mother. I think that's a nice touch there. Her instinct to protect her children kicks in instantly when she sees those pictures. That's a nice touch. Of course, she starred in the terrible fourth Jaws movie, Jaws: The Revenge, which was just a mess. But she does a decent job in that. Really, I mean, the fact that the movie is awful is not her fault. She does her job and does the best she can. It basically is a combination of Jaws in terms of endearment because of her relationship with Michael Caine. It's just, I don't know. Maybe I'll get around to doing a commentary about that one day if I'm feeling kind of sadomasochistic. This scene here was one more that was a very, very difficult thing to shoot. From what I understand, they shot it during the day and, made it look like nighttime with the lenses and things they used in post-production. But and the guys' voices are dubbed in much the same way I mentioned that Susan Backline's dialogue and screams were dubbed in the first part. Here's the pictures I meant, like looking at these, and that's a nice little touch there that they added that shark tower into Jaws too. But anyway, they couldn't get the dock to break away correctly. They couldn't decide whether or not they wanted the one guy that falls in the water to live. I actually think it was a nice touch that he lives, not necessarily because you care about the character, but because it makes it apparent that not every person that falls in the water is going to die. So it keeps the audience on edge. You don't know if someone for the rest of the movie is going to get away or not. So I think it was a good choice to have this guy make it. But the best scene, in my opinion, of this sequence here is when the doc kind of does this slow turnaround to start coming after the guy in the water. And they just couldn't get the dock to turn around correctly, and they had to go back to this several times and film things, multiple times to actually get it to do what it needed to do. There it is, the dock turning around as the music starts that beat. I think that's great right there. And what he says to the guy makes complete sense. Just don't look back, just swim. That's probably about the best thing you could tell somebody in that situation. Just swim. I have to remind myself to keep talking and not just start watching the movie. It's easy to do with Jaws. This has always been one of my favorite movies. It was actually the first VHS tape that I ever had. It was one of the first VHS. I don't remember what year it was, but when VCRs first became reasonably priced enough to buy, and by reasonably priced, I mean not $2,000 or $1,500. I think our first VCR was $1,000, but my parents bought me one for my birthday, and they bought me two movies to go along with it. One was Jaws, and one was the original Universal Frankenstein. And I watched Jaws, of course, it was the first movie I watched on my VCR, and I woke up the next day and watched it again and watched it many, many times after that. That's Craig Kingsbury that I mentioned before, the local Martha's Vineyard kind of version of Quint, welcoming Richard Dreyfuss as Hooper. Hooper is one of the major differences between the book and the film. The character Hooper in the book is very different. He's still a shark researcher and is still a wealthy person, but that's about all that's the same. In the book, Hooper is a young guy, very good looking, very kind of with it, and he actually has an affair with Ellen Brody, the sheriff's wife. Apparently Benchley needed to add that in order to get the book sold. In the 70s, you had to have some sort of illicit sex type stuff, in order to get your book actually published. for obvious reasons, I'm glad they didn't put that in the film. I think it works much better to have all the emphasis and all the focus in the movie devoted to the shark, but also it works to have Richard Dreyfuss's character as an ally to Brody. Some of the other choices for Hooper, by the way, were Jeff Bridges, who I could definitely see in the role. The other was apparently Jan Michael Vincent, who I can't see in the part, unless they were going to have Hooper be more similar to what he was in the novel. Jan Michael Vincent coincidentally passed away just a week or two ago as I'm doing this. But here, Hooper is just kind of an awkward, kind of smart guy, and you root for him to be able to help Brody instantly. And there again is Craig Kinsbury playing Ben Gardner. And Ben Gardner is a character in the book too, by the way. His death via the shark is handled in a similar way. It's not exactly the same, but it's similar. I think Dreyfuss does a great job in these scenes when he's looking at the body. The emphasis here that Hooper knows all about these sharks. He's obviously seen shark victims before, and for him to be as horrified as he obviously is by what he sees right there, where he has to just take a deep breath even to get through his examination, is a nice touch. When someone who knows about things is horrified at what's going on, it just kind of ramps up the tension and the drama. Like, even this guy can't believe what he's seeing. What I mentioned too about the books and having to add in sex and stuff, I think that's the same. It's the same reason that Mario Puzo added in some of the stuff in the Godfather book with Sonny and the affair with the woman who, in the movie idea of things, became Vincent's mother, because there doesn't really add much to the story. Even though both Hooper's scenes with Ellen are very tame by today's standards. I read the book. I was reading the Jaws book, I think, when I was in about third grade, as soon as I can read. And even though the sexual scenes between Ellen and Hooper in the book are very mild, as a young kid, I didn't understand what some of the words meant. It was kind of, I think my parents had forgotten that there was some sex depicted in when they bought me the book to read. But I was obsessed with the movie Jaws, so I had to read the book. And here we go. Here's Meadows doing what I said. Like right here, if you had him acting like the newspaper man, it would have been more obvious that that's what he is. I think having him on the ferry scene kind of confused the audience as to what his job really is in the town. And that's the first look, of course, that we get at the Orca with Quint at the helm. And you get the idea here that Quint already knows that's not the shark. Quint's too smart. He knows too much about the sea to think that this group of bozos, as Hooper calls them, somehow managed to stumble upon this shark and could actually catch the kind of fish that would be going around eating all these people and causing all this turmoil. That's a real tiger shark, by the way, too. It was caught with the help and maybe completely by a guy who helped on the production named Teddy Grossman. He Grossman is in the film a little bit later. I'll point him out when that comes up. And then there's Mayor Vaughn with a pink shirt under one of his many colorful blazers. I've never understood what that guy's doing blowing on Hooper behind him. A lot of people have made reference to the guy, again, all Martha's Vineyard locals, that does the what when Hooper calls it a tiger shark. But the thing I find much more bizarre is the one who's blowing on Hooper. I don't really know what that's supposed to be about, but and here you really feel for Brody, at least I do. He wants to believe so much that it's over, that they've caught the shark and things can go back to normal, but it's just not gonna happen. And Murray Hamilton is fantastic here too. And one of the things I like about the Mayor Vaughn character in the movie is you understand where he's coming from. He's not doing this to protect his own ass. He never mentions, boy, this will be bad for my re-election chances if the economy goes down the toilet in Amity. Although you can assume that's probably part of it, but I think, at least I get the impression, he genuinely cares about the town. He's trying to do his job. And right there, I mean, what he says makes sense. You don't want to do this autopsy here and pull out what's left of Alex Kittner. I mean, that makes some sense. So you don't get the idea that he's just a complete jackass. Even though he makes some horrible decisions, he's still sympathetic, in my opinion. Lee Fierro here, for a non-professional actress, does a really good job here. And this is exactly how you would feel. My child is dead for absolutely no reason. This could have all been prevented, and it's senseless, and I need someone to blame. This scene is in the book too, by the way, but it takes place in Brody's office. I think it's much more effective to have it happen here in front of everyone. And you see just how horrible Brody feels, and you feel horrible right along with him. In many ways, it makes Brody's struggle against the shark much more personal. And she does a really good job. I assume that the guy with her is supposed to be the character's father. Well, that's great. That's a great bit of acting right there, and some good dialogue that tells the story with very few words. But even there too, I mean, you see the mayor, I mean, he feels bad for Brody as well. I think that's genuine. There's an interesting story about the scene right here, which I think is great, between Brody and his youngest son, Sean. Spielberg and the crew were setting up in another part of this house to film something else. I don't know what. And Roy Scheider was sitting next to the little boy that plays Sean, and the little boy just started mimicking Roy Scheider's movements on his own. This wasn't anything planned. And Roy Scheider was smart enough to go over and pull Spielberg to the side and say, look, watch this, watch what he's doing. And Spielberg, being the brilliant director that he is, stopped what he was doing and quickly changed things to make sure they got this on film. And it's really a nice touch. It shows Brody as a father, more than a scripted scene probably ever could. And it also goes along with something in Jaws too, with Sean being very loyal to his father and going and picking up the bullets after Brody runs down from the shark tower and shoots up the beach because he thinks a school of bluefish is the shark coming toward the beach. Jaws 2 obviously is not the great film that Jaws is, but as far as a sequel goes, I think it's decent. It's got some good ideas in it. I like the fact that the shark is scarred up. It does change things around a little bit. Roy Scheider, as I mentioned before, did not want to participate in Jaws 2 at all, but he was contractually obligated to. They asked Richard Dreyfuss to participate in the second film, and after the nightmare that the first one was, he decided not to, which I can't blame him at all. But he mentions the Aurora here, Hooper does, and in the part in Jaws 2, as Brody becomes more and more convinced that there is another shark around, he places a call to Hooper, and he gets home one night, and Ellen has taken a message from, well, she just gets off the phone with Hooper, that he is on the Aurora, which is the boat he mentions here in a minute. I thought that was a nice touch just for continuity purposes. It made some sense that that's where he'd be, since that's where he says he's headed. There's a Jaws 2 book too, by the way, and in many ways, in my opinion, it's better than Benchley's book. It was in the 70s and 80s, and I think even into the 90s, they did this a lot with big movies. They would have novels written based on the screenplay for the movie, instead of vice versa, where you base movies on books. They would come out with a book, basically to use it as a marketing tool and just a way to make a little bit of extra money from a movie. And that's one of the things that makes the Jaws 2 book interesting, because it's based on the first screenplay, which was very, very dark. Amity apparently is in a complete economic depression and spiraling even further downward, which is easy to see why after all the trouble they have here with the shark. And it expands upon an idea that's in the Jaws novel, the original, about Mayor Vaughn being involved with some mafia type people. And in Jaws 2, the mob is still part of the story. They're planning to open up some casinos in Amity to try to get the economy going. And that I won't give it away in case you want to read it, but that ends up getting involved with the shark killing people again. But it is interesting. It has a lot to do with diving. And there's a major character in the book that's a diving instructor, and instead of boating, Brody's oldest son Michael is interested in diving more than anything. And it's, again, if you can pick it up, it's a good book, and it's definitely worth reading. And it's a lot like the original Jaws novel. It's a quick read. It's not something you're gonna have to devote several months to get through. It's not War and Peace. If Brody's really getting drunk on red wine, boy, he is going to really feel horrible the next day. And I don't really know what he was drinking originally when Hooper got there. But whatever it is, I'm sure it probably doesn't mix well with red wine, which is probably going to make whatever hangover he has feel even worse. And luckily, I have no idea what the inside of a shark actually smells like, but I think it's safe to assume that it smells just as bad as they're acting like it smells here. And I don't know what that is. I don't know if that's genuinely what the inside of a shark would look like. Just a milky substance pouring out of it, but it looks awfully disgusting, which is how it's exactly how it's supposed to look for this movie. Now those look like almost, obviously that's the head of a fish, and then it looks like a an entire fish that he throws out there. This right here, this 007 Louisiana, this was around the time that Roger Moore took over the role of James Bond 007. I'm a huge James Bond film fan, by the way. And Live and Let Die takes place partly in Louisiana. So I don't know if that's just a total coincidence that license plate has 007 Louisiana on it, or if that was some kind of a reference. I know Spielberg is a big James Bond fan. I've always wondered about that, and I've never heard any sort of confirmation or denial of that either way. But anyway, that tiger shark to me did not look big enough to just be swallowing fish whole. I'm sure it really would have all kinds of things in its stomach if you cut it open, but it seems like they'd be a little more chewed up than that. But I guess you get the point of that was to make it look like it was a bad, dangerous shark, and it does the job. And this is one more scene again that was very complicated to film and to get right. This scene is in the book. That when they find Ben Gardner's boat, they first try to hire Ben Gardner to try and find and catch the shark, and they later spot his boat, which is called the Flicka, just floating aimlessly in the water. So Brody and Hendricks go out to check it out, not Brody and Hooper. As I mentioned in the book, Brody and Hooper have a very adversarial relationship. Even though Brody suspects something may have happened between Hooper and Ellen, he never knows for sure. And even before that, Hooper just comes from kind of the ritzy part of Amity, and he automatically doesn't like him, even before he has suspicions about him and Ellen. So anyway, Brody and Hendricks go out to check out the boat, and they find a shark tooth just like Hooper does, and they find that the shark is torn off a cleat, but there's no body, which makes more sense actually than what happens in the movie, even though it's not as exciting. That if you were killed by a shark, your body would not be still on the boat. The shark would have carried away part of it, and whatever was left would be at the bottom of the ocean. But they filmed this scene originally, and the way it was written was the character of Meadows is along with Brody and Hooper. As I mentioned, Meadows was a major character in the book, and in the original screenplay, he was also a larger character, which makes sense because Peter Benchley wrote the first draft of the screenplay. And so Carl Gottlieb, Scheider, and Dreyfuss were on a much smaller, much different boat than they're on here, and they go out to try to check out what's left of Ben Gardner's boat, and Carl Gottlieb leaned over and fell out of the boat, and they had to kind of pull him back in, and they were filming that scene during the day. And they decided, you know what, we'll just come back to this later. And eventually, Carl Gottlieb himself, who was working on the screenplay, changed it so he was not in the scene at all. I don't know if it was just because he didn't want to fall in the water again, or because he genuinely understood that his character is not needed. I've heard Gottlieb mention that it's one of the hardest things he's had to do was to write himself as an actor out of scenes. As he was working on the script, but I also think that takes a lot of professional integrity to do what's best for the story, even if it's, kind of damaging your time on screen. And I don't know if they filmed this sequence during the day, and just had it appear as night or what. I think that's likely. If there's anything worse than filming on the water during the day, it's filming on the water at night. So I have a feeling this was actually filmed during the day, but I've never known for sure either way. And I've also never known exactly here. Spielberg added the scene with Ben Gardner's head later on after he had seen a screening of the movie with an actual audience. Spielberg decided, I can get one more big scare out of this if I add in a quick jump here with finding Ben Gardner's head kind of floating out of this hole here. And they actually filmed this in Verna Fields, who does an excellent job editing this movie. They filmed this in her swimming pool, not this sequence right here, but the part with the head, and just kind of added some milk to make the water look like ocean water. But here Hooper has the tooth, which was obviously originally intended, and he drops the tooth when that head pops out. And that is a great scare, but it doesn't make any sense for the body or what's left of it to be somehow in the boat right there. But it's worth overlooking that just for the moment in the movie. But Hooper does drop the tooth, and he dropped the tooth anyway in the way the scene was originally filmed without the head. But I don't know why he dropped the tooth in the original version. And the fact that they went back and added the head also explains something that as a kid never made sense to me here. As they're having this argument, I think this is a great scene, by the way, with Brody and Hooper trying to talk to the mayor. But they mention that Hooper finds the tooth when they're trying to convince Vaughn that there's proof the shark is still out there. But they don't bother mentioning the fact that they also found Ben Gardner's torn up body, which it seems like that would be the first thing you talk about. But because they filmed this scene before they added the head, see here he is mentioning the tooth, that's why they don't mention it to the mayor, because that wasn't originally the plan. But the original plan was to have Hooper drop the tooth because he doesn't have it anymore. But I don't know what caused him to do that the way the scene was originally shot, and nothing I found mentions it. I guess only Steven Spielberg knows, because I'm not sure Richard Dreyfuss knows. None of the scenes of Hooper underwater are actually Richard Dreyfuss. Not in the scenes we just saw, and not any of the scenes where he's in the cage later on. None of that is Richard Dreyfuss. But one of the reasons I like this scene, and it reminds me, another Godfather reference coming up, is there's a scene in The Godfather where Michael comes home after his jaw has been broken by McCluskey, who was played, ironically, by Sterling Hayden, who, as I mentioned before, was up for the role of Quint in this movie. But he comes home, and Sonny has semi-taken over the family because Don Corleone has been shot and he's in the hospital, and Sonny is on a rant about who he wants to kill and this and that, and Tom Hagen is trying to be the reasonable person in the room, trying to calm him down. Clemenza and Tessio are there. Michael comes in and is quiet, but it's a scene that kind of reminds me of this. Is everyone is completely in character. The actors are doing a great job. The dialogue is perfect for exactly what the motivations and the personality of their characters are. And then, of course, at the end of that scene is when Michael demonstrates who he really is, when he comes up with the plan to kill Sollozzo and McCluskey and all that. But this scene reminds me of that, just because everyone is just perfectly in character and following their characters' motivations here, and it's just a long shot. There's only a couple of cuts here. It's basically just like setting the camera up and saying, "Here's the dialogue, go for it." You don't see that much anymore in movies, unfortunately. Movies today are made with many cuts, many different angles, and for some reason they think it's more visually appealing and keeps an audience more interested if they change angles and make cuts constantly, and that's just not the way in my opinion it works. It's much more fascinating just to sit and watch and let the actors and the dialogue do their jobs. And here we have all the folks arriving for July 4th. Now, obviously, some of these are extras. They film most of Jaws in Martha's Vineyard, at least the part that aren't out in the water. These scenes were filmed in the off season. Martha's Vineyard was not going to let a huge movie production come and interrupt their summer season. So when you see these people in the water, they're trying not to freeze to death, but these are a lot of extras to have just to set up the 4th of July scenes. I've wondered if maybe they went back to Martha's Vineyard during the summer season and got some of these shots of actual people arriving and walking around, like everyone on that boat. It just seems like it would be too big of an undertaking to get all those extras on a boat and to have the boat coming, across the water and stuff. But I've never been able to find out for sure if all of this was arranged just for the movie. And this guy playing the reporter is Peter Benchley. It's nice they could stick him in the movie, even though he had some problems with the way the film, or at least the screenplay, turned out after he had turned in his first draft. Peter Benchley himself used to be a reporter, so I guess it was an easy casting choice to make. But Benchley, among some other things, thought that Spielberg kind of watered down the characters, which is true. He did water down the characters from the novel a bit because he wanted the story to focus on the shark versus the town, and the shark versus Martin Brody, which was definitely the right decision. But from the original author's point of view, I understand what he's saying. He also had a problem with the fact that Brody kills the shark by shooting the tank. Apparently that's not what a breathing tank does. If you shoot a hole in it, it doesn't blow up. It made sense to me. It seemed, and I thought for years that's really what would happen if you shot an air tank. But apparently it just does a slow kind of leak. But Spielberg's explanation eventually, which is true, is if I've carried the audience this far, and if they're with me, at the end of the movie, they'll believe pretty much anything I give them. And that's exactly true, and that's what happened. As I mentioned, these people are in the water. I don't remember the exact month this was filmed, but it was not summer, so that water is very, very cold. That's why you see the two kids when they pop up later with the fake fin. The one kid is shivering even though he's wearing a diving suit because that water is very cold. Chris Belomo, by the way, is the local Martha's Vineyard kid who plays Michael Brody. He died at a very young age. He was just 37. He had a heart attack, which is kind of strange and sad. But really, when you think about it, unfortunately, there aren't a lot of the main cast members here in Jaws who are still with us. Roy Scheider has passed away. Robert Shaw passed away just a few years after Jaws. Murray Hamilton died, I believe, sometime in the 90s. Lorraine Gary and Richard Dreyfuss, as far as the main cast members, are the only ones that are still around, as far as I can remember off the top of my head. It's too bad. And they give you a clue here that this is not the actual shark because John Williams' music is not playing, which is kind of a giveaway that this is not truly the shark. There's no shark theme. The only time you hear John Williams' theme is when the real shark is around. And you can see here too just how much less effective it is without the music. If they were playing the music over those shots of the legs, you'd have the same reaction as the other scenes. But that's good evidence of how important music is in a movie, especially a movie like this. There's an important Fourth of July sequence in the book too, by the way, but it goes down much differently. There are no kids with a fake fin and this huge panic we're seeing here. They're actually using Ben Gardner's boat to patrol the water. Hooper is basically doing what he's doing here with Ben Gardner's boat, and Brody is on a stretch of beach just kind of walking around where there's not a lot of people, and there are quite a few people that show up for the 4th of July weekend, but most of them are apparently there because they think they're just going to see some big shark swimming around, and that's what's brought them there. There aren't a lot of people in the water, and there's a new, for obvious reasons, I don't blame them. I wouldn't be in the water either. And there's a news crew interviewing Brody and a group of young boys nearby. I'd guess I think they're, I don't know, age 9 to 12-ish. And one of the boys offers, I think it's $20 to one of the other boys if he'll go swimming in the water, which in 1974, $20 to a little kid's a lot of money. So he goes in the water, and of course the shark that hasn't made an appearance in several days at this point, which is why they reopened the beach, comes and is heading toward the kid, and Hooper is in the boat trying to get to shore because he's spotted the shark by now, trying to get the shark, and Brody is running into the water to get the boy, and Brody grabs the kid right before the shark gets him, and that kind of confirms that the shark is still around and that they're going to have to hire Quint. And the news crew, of course, gets it all on video, and that's kind of the end of the denials that there's a shark problem. The two boys, by the way, that play the guys with the fake fin originally auditioned and were considered for the roles of Michael and Sean Brody, which it seems to me they would have been fine for, but they chose them for the pranksters instead. And my favorite shot of the shark is coming up here in a minute. Not that one, although that's great, just to show the size of the shark, to see its fins there as it glides along. But there's a shot, and this is Teddy Grossman in the red boat, who I mentioned had caught the tiger shark they used in the earlier scene. So I guess the shark world gets its revenge on him here in a minute. But there's a quick shot. There's a couple of quick shots of the shark. One when it's beneath the water, swimming toward Grossman, coming up right there. But the next shot of the shark as it sinks back into the water is great. I think that right there, it just lasts a second or less. But there's something horrifying about about seeing the shark right there. For one thing, it looks 100% authentic. It's very real, and it's in the middle of an attack. I think the first shot that most people think of, as far as when you get a good clear picture of the shark, is the famous scene where Brody is on the orca and he's chumming, and that's fantastic too. And you do get a better shot of the shark there. You see its entire head as it pops out of the water, and it's just so unexpected the first time you see it. But I really think that shot right there is, in my opinion, the most terrifying look at the shark that we get. Just about, it's hard to beat. And originally, this scene was different as well. That shot of Sean, by the way, is actually taken from the earlier beach scene with Alex Kintner getting attacked by the shark. But the scene there with Michael in the water and the shark close by was very different originally. The shark, and they filmed it this way too. the shark had Teddy Grossman in its mouth and was carrying him off into the far reaches of the ocean, I guess, to finish him off. And as he swam by Michael, Grossman's character was still alive, and he grabs onto Michael, and it looks as if he might carry Michael beneath the water and out into the ocean depths along with him, but at the last minute lets him go, and that's what sends Michael into shock. But they thought that was just too grisly and changed it where you still get the idea of what's happening, but you just see the shark kind of zooming by Michael instead. And you can see, you can't see the scene as it was intended to be shown if they had kept it, but you can see kind of the outtakes of them filming that scene if you check out some of the videos on YouTube. I thought there was a nice touch too with Ellen there, asking if he wants to go back to New York, kind of indicating she's had it with Amity. This idea of a more peaceful life in a small Mayberry type town is not working out the way she thought it was going to. But Brody makes his stand, and he's not going to be run off from his home by this shark, which I think is great. It really shows the strength of the character. And here's what I mean by Vaughn. He says he was acting in the town's best interest, which he was. And yeah, you can make an argument that he's just as worried about his own job as mayor, and that's completely legitimate. But here, I mean, he's genuinely devastated by what's happened. And I understand bringing him back for Jaws 2, but I don't think it's very realistic that Mayor Vaughn would still be the mayor after all this. Of course, you want to have as many cast members in a sequel from the original as you can possibly manage, but they could have had him in the movie just in some different capacity, but I think they might have benefited from having someone else as the mayor. Maybe a younger guy that was cocky and you didn't like, and possibly would even get eaten by the shark itself. But these are some good scenes with Quint. Obviously, they do a lot in establishing his character. That spitting out of the liquor. I would love to have a sip of whatever Quint's idea of homemade liquor is. I'm sure it's not for the faint of heart. That's a nice touch too. Don't drink that. You almost get the idea that was an ad lib from Roy Scheider. This home that we see for Quint, they actually built from scratch. The production crew was only able to do it when the town of Martha's Vineyard told them, okay, you can build this structure that's going to serve as Quint's home, as long as when you're finished, you tear it down completely and there's no sign it was ever there, and you return everything to exactly how it looked before. Originally, there were a few more scenes that took place in Quint's home, but all we're left with is this one. There, of course, is Quint's chair that he eventually has on the orca itself. But I think it's odd, actually. I don't really know what else you would necessarily have taking place at Quint's home. I've never seen which scenes they had in mind that they would have used in addition to this one, because you just don't need to see Quint hanging out at home. So I don't know what they were, but that's why they went to the trouble of building the entire place. But they were just left with this one. And this is what makes this movie well, just another thing that makes this movie just stand out so completely is the three guys, Roy Scheider, Richard Dreyfuss, and Robert Shaw. It's hard enough when you're casting a movie to come up with good chemistry between two people, much less three. And the way these guys all play off of each other throughout this is just unbeatable. It's a lot of fun to watch. And again, if you're watching this, you're probably already aware of how much animosity existed between Richard Dreyfuss and Robert Shaw. And Spielberg apparently didn't do anything to squelch it, and neither did anyone else, because it worked for the characters. I don't know if that's why Robert Shaw behaved the way he did or not. Robert Shaw was a notorious alcoholic. He would start off, according to the guy that would come and pick him up and then take him to the dock in order to get him out to the spot where they'd be filming on the ocean that day. Shaw would start off about 5 o'clock in the morning, which is when he would be picked up, by drinking martinis. And then he'd get him out to the boat, and for the rest of the day, he would drink other liquor, whether it was whiskey or scotch or both or whatever. And that is some hard drinking. And to be a functional alcoholic with that kind of an alcohol intake is a whole different level of alcoholism. And obviously that can make you somewhat of an ornery character, and he bullied and picked on Richard Dreyfuss unmercifully. And Richard Dreyfuss, according to Roy Scheider, made himself kind of an easy target. He would try to kind of battle back with him, but he was just not on Robert Shaw's level as far as that kind of stuff goes. Robert Shaw would call him lazy and challenge him to do push-ups and just anything to get under his skin. Richard Dreyfuss one day, I guess, got fed up and apparently threw Robert Shaw's daily liquor supply into the ocean, which is not something you do to a alcoholic of Robert Shaw's magnitude. Needless to say, that did not go over well. This little poem, or whatever you want to call it, that Quint repeats about, here lies the body of Mary Lee, died at the age of 103, is apparently something he saw written on a tombstone, which is strange, but that's what a good actor does, saves things like that up until there's an occasion to use them. Robert Shaw also, as I mentioned, he's in The Sting. He had a long, really great career. He's in From Russia with Love, if you haven't seen the second James Bond movie. Him and Sean Connery have a really good fight in From Russia with Love. It's worth checking out just for that, and to see Robert Shaw and to see him as a young guy and looking as tough as he does in that movie. And now we're into the third act, and in my opinion, this is where Quint pretty much takes over the movie. He's such a dominating, interesting character. The main focus from here on in is Quint versus his version of Moby Dick, which is, of course, the great white shark. And I don't say that as a criticism or a complaint at all. I think it's fantastic. It really works, and that's not to say that suddenly Brody and Hooper become unimportant to the story. Brody in particular still stands out here, and Hooper has his moments as well. But it's Quint that's front and center for the rest of the movie, and I think that's a great thing. And here we go, setting up the issue with the oxygen tanks that I mentioned earlier, that apparently don't really blow up if you shoot one. They built two versions of the Orca, by the way, one of which was completely fabricated from scratch and was built to sink. The other was a boat that already was a working boat that they purchased and then redesigned and re-outfitted to look like they needed the Orca to look. And Jaws being Jaws and the production of Jaws being the production of Jaws, that boat is the one that actually ends up sinking. I'll point that out when that sequence happens a little bit later. The main difference between the third act of the film and the third act of the book is that in the book, every night at the end of the day, they go back to land and dock the boat and then set out again the next day, which takes a lot of the drama and the tension out of it. One of the reasons this third act in the film is so effective is you get the sense that the three guys here are truly out in the ocean alone with this shark that's determined to kill them before they can kill it, and continually going back to shore and then going out again the next day, especially if you're someone like Brody or even Hooper, just it is kind of hard to swallow, no pun intended. And this sort of thing right here is where Spielberg really shines. Watching Quint get ready and the showing his face and no one else paying attention, and he really knows how to ramp up the tension in these parts. Of course, it's a little unclear about whether Quint really catches the shark here or not. Quint is obviously convinced that it is the great white because it's too big and because it ends up biting through the wire he's using, which he describes as piano wire. Hooper doesn't think so, and it's kind of left up in the air. That's a good shot of the boat there, obviously. And I like here that Brody's doing his best to help. He has no idea what's happening, and then the suntan lotion on his nose is a good touch. And there's the barrels. There's part of the production behind the scenes information that I've heard several times that doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. They talk about the barrels being an important stand-in for the shark because of the issues we've talked about this entire commentary, that the shark just didn't work. But the barrels are also an important part of the story in the book, and they're important to what's going on in the film. It would not have made any sense to have the shark swimming above the water or even near the surface of the water during the third act here, or at least for most of it. So I don't really understand how the barrels are standing in for the shark, because the shark wouldn't work and they couldn't show it. It seems to me you wouldn't be showing the shark during that stuff anyway. I could be wrong. Maybe there's a few shots where they're showing barrels instead of what they would have liked to have shown of the shark, but I don't know. That's never been really clear to me what's meant by that. And I mentioned the antagonism between Dreyfuss and Shaw, and the fact that it worked for the story, and you can see why. It's okay that they didn't like each other behind the scenes, because they're not supposed to really like each other here. Of course, that changes on the night they spend on the boat. They have a nice bonding moment over comparing their scars and that sort of thing, and I think come to an understanding. But they're certainly at odds for a lot of the third act. There's an interesting video I've seen on YouTube, by the way, that's an interview with Richard Dreyfuss, and I can't remember what show the interview is from or who he's talking to, but he was apparently in town to do the interview, and I guess it's, if I remember correctly, it's Robert Shaw's granddaughter lived in the town or the city where he's doing the interview, and from what I remember, she made it known to the people on the show that she wanted to see Richard Dreyfuss, and obviously identified herself. And he met with her, Richard Dreyfuss, before the show, and they had a conversation. I may be messing up some of the details here, but the interviewer asked Richard Dreyfuss about that conversation, and Richard Dreyfuss starts crying, and not just a little bit of tears. He's on the verge of sobs. And I don't know that he uses this wording exactly, but you just get the idea that provided him with some sort of a sense of closure as far as his relationship with Robert Shaw. And it also makes it very clear that despite the fact that they did not get along, which is an understatement, he clearly had a ton of respect for Robert Shaw and his performance in this film and what he had accomplished throughout his career. It's definitely worth looking up if you're at all into Jaws, or even if you're just a fan of Robert Shaw and or Richard Dreyfuss. This is a good shot of Quint up top. And the third act as well is also when the production basically came within a hair's breadth of becoming a complete debacle. Shooting out on the ocean was incredibly challenging. Maintaining the sense that they are out on this boat, just the three of them all alone and cut off from anyone else, was a tough illusion to keep up. Anytime another boat just inched into the frame, the production would have to shut down and wait until that boat cleared its way out of the frame, which could take hours. And here, of course, is when we get the first really clear look at the great white shark. And that really is an excellent piece of film history right there. It's great. And if you know anything about Jaws, you know, and it's been confirmed, that Roy Scheider ad-libbed the "you're gonna need a bigger boat" line, which of course now has a history all its own. The look on Robert Shaw's face here is great, and then combine that with John Williams' music and the look at the shark as it swims toward the boat and then passes is awesome. And awesome in every sense of the word. This is just really exciting movie making right here. They built 3 versions of the shark, by the way. The first, which they're using there, is almost a complete model of the shark, and he's riding on a track just like the other sharks that sticks out of the bottom, and he rides along, so when you need a shot like we just saw from above, the shark looks complete. The other 2 models of the shark that they used were completely open on one side, which is where the gears and the mechanisms that made the shark work would all be taking up one side of the shark, while the other side of the shark was painted and made to look like a shark. And then the other model was just the exact opposite. So you would always have a shark to use when you needed one moving from right to left or from left to right. And they use some sort of a system of pneumatic hoses, and I do not pretend to understand at all how that made the shark work. I guess it was pressure in one valve or pump and then taking it out of another that would make the shark kind of lurch from side to side. That's about as good as of an understanding of the whole process as I have. The shark was designed by Joe Alves, who did a great job as the production designer on this entire movie. Excuse me. And he also directed Jaws 3, which I think gets a bad rap. Jaws 3 is not a spectacular movie by any stretch of the imagination, but I think it's got some good points. Its main problem, or one of its main problems really, is the whole 3D gimmick, which is never a good idea for a movie in my opinion. But The shark was actually constructed by Bob Matty, who came out of retirement specifically to do the shark. And even though the shark was incredibly problematic, to say the least, I'm not sure there's anyone else alive that could have actually built the thing even to work as well as it did, which was very spotty. But Bob Matty also built the giant squid for 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and that was the closest thing that anyone had ever done to constructing a shark like the one they needed for this movie. And this is thrilling right here with the lining up the barrel and Quint waiting on the shot and everything else. This is just spectacular movie making. I don't mean to gush and gush, but just telling it like I see it. And see, there's a barrel, and obviously you don't see the shark, but I don't think you're supposed to see the shark right there. This would be a realistic way to catch a big, huge shark, is use these barrels to wear the shark out so he has to come up toward the surface, and then you can pump other harpoons into him or just drag him around until he stops fighting and he drowns. Sharks have to keep moving in the water in order not to drown. It's something about oxygen moving across their gills or through their mouth or something like that. I'm not an oceanographer, obviously. But the production here just dragged on and on and on. The shark was completely uncooperative once they got it into the ocean. It worked just great when they tested it in the tanks at Universal Studios. But obviously there is a huge difference between something working in a controlled environment like a tank at a movie studio and taking it out into the salt water of the ocean. Salt water is incredibly corrosive and just plays havoc with anything it touches, and that's before you've even dealt with issues like weather and the waves and the terrain of the ocean floor, which is not smooth at all. And because that's where they had to run the track for the shark to run on. So it was a nightmare by all accounts. And this is a nice sequence. Obviously, all of this was created for the film, because this was not in the book, since they were going back to port every night. And this is a nice bonding moment between Hooper and Quint. And there's a great little part here coming up where Roy Scheider, who has nothing, despite the fact that he's a police officer originally from New York City, he doesn't have anything to compare with Quint and Hooper's aquatic injuries or arm wrestling injuries, except for an appendix scar. It's all he's got, and he decides that's probably not worth bragging about. And of course, what this is all leading up to is Robert Shaw's very famous Indianapolis speech, which you could spend 2 hours just going into everything they had to struggle against trying to get this part done. The first was just getting it on paper. Everyone involved in the production took a shot at it, even people not involved. I know one of the people Spielberg approached to help out was John Milius, and they just kept trying and trying. Roy Scheider participated, and finally the Indianapolis speech was almost word for word written by Robert Shaw himself. So it's fitting that that's one of the main things you remember about the character. And the reason they included the Indianapolis speech was because they felt they needed some sort of an explanation about why Quint hated sharks so deeply. and I think they were right. You wouldn't miss it if it wasn't in the movie. I don't think anyone would sit and watch Jaws and think, gee, I wish I knew why Quint hated sharks, but it would not be the same film without the Indianapolis speech in it. And it was so powerful that Zanuck and Brown's original idea for a Jaws sequel was not to continue the story of Amity or Sheriff Brody, but it was to do a movie about the Indianapolis sinking. The other major challenge they had with the Indianapolis speech was getting it shot. Robert Shaw, who, as I've mentioned throughout the commentary, was a notorious drinker, asked Steven Spielberg that since Quint is supposed to be drunk during the Indianapolis speech, if he could have, I guess, extra alcohol on top of the alcohol he usually consumed so that he would be a little drunk during the filming. And Spielberg said, okay, sure, go for it. I mean, why not? You're talking about Robert Shaw, so whatever you think will help you, go for it. But Robert Shaw, even as big as an alcoholic as he obviously was, didn't really have control of his drinking past a certain point, I guess, and was too drunk to complete filming the scene. And this is actually a kind of a sad story. I mean, you have to feel for the guy, but Shaw woke up the next day. I doubt he remembered exactly what happened, but he obviously remembered enough to know that it didn't go well. He called Steven Spielberg and said, asked him how badly did I humiliate myself last night? And Spielberg told him something like, well, not irrevocably so. And he asked for another shot at it, and Spielberg said, yes, of course. So Shaw, the story is that Shaw did the speech again completely sober. I don't know if they mean completely sober like a normal human being is completely sober, or sober for Robert Shaw, meaning he had some alcohol in him, but not as much as he usually would have. Because if you're that big of an alcoholic, you have to have some alcohol, usually just to function. But what they did in the editing together of the Indianapolis speech, some of the shots, like this one we're looking at here, were from the first night when this shot looks like it's from the second night, and some of the other shots are from the first night when he's highly, highly intoxicated. And if you watch the movie enough, you can get a pretty good idea of which shots are from which evening. As I mentioned, the shot we were just looking at, his eyes, and this one too, look pretty clear. And he's not slurring too bad. He seems coherent, but there's some other shots where his eyes are very glossy, and he is slurring more than he is in some of the other shots. And I think it's safe to assume those are from the first night. And you could go through the speech and and kind of pick and choose first night, second night, and you'd pretty much be correct. And there goes the whale songs. Orca, by the way, in case you don't know, the name of the boat Orca is another name for a killer whale. And after Jaws was such a success, any opportunity other companies had to produce anything similar to Jaws, they jumped all over it. And one of the things they made was a movie called Orca that was about a killer whale. I've seen the movie a couple of times, but it's been a long time ago, and it's a decent flick from what I remember. it's basically something where both times I watched it, I remember being on the side of the killer whale, because it's basically taking vengeance for the fact that a group of whale hunters have killed the orca's mate and the mate's unborn baby, and so the killer whale is out to seek vengeance. Again, it's a decent movie, but it's certainly not Jaws, but there's not much that is. These are also good because you never, or at least I don't ever really doubt that the shark would be attacking the boat. In reality, that doesn't make any sense, that a shark would just suddenly decide, well, it's the middle of the night, so I'm going to attack this boat. But I guess that's down to the strength of Steven Spielberg, where you don't really doubt it for a second. And we saw Brody there about to call for help, and you saw a reaction from Quint that he doesn't want that to happen. There's another, it's a little bit confusing to me anyway, about why Quint refuses to let Brody call for help. And it's also unclear what happens after that. I'll talk more about it when we get to it. But to me, Quint's motivations at some point are not exactly clear. I get that he wants to take on the shark and doesn't want any help, but then shortly afterwards he seems scared. But we'll see. And there was another scene too where you saw a barrel and Quint shooting at the barrel when he's not shooting at the barrel, he's shooting at the shark below, but I don't know that you would have seen the shark right there. Maybe you would, and maybe that would have been very effective to see the shark near the surface there at night, because we don't ever really see the shark at night. But there's no way to know. I've never gotten a good explanation about the whole barrel thing. You can also tell when they're using one orca or the next. Sometimes the orca from the back, the word orca is very clear, and then at other points it's very faded and almost looks like you can barely see it, even on a Blu-ray, which is what I'm watching it on right now. You can kind of tell the difference between the two orcas in that way. I'm trying to keep talking. I'll get wrapped up again in watching the movie and not actually providing any commentary. But there's some good shots of the shark coming up here, and this would hurt like hell if you've ever had a rope burn or anything. A shark pulling this kind of thing right out of your hand with that sort of force would hurt like hell. I've been to Universal in Los Angeles many times, and they still have a very simplistic Jaws encounter as part of their tram tour, which they've had for years. Universal Orlando had a Jaws ride that was a lot more elaborate and a lot of fun, but it's been gone, I think, a few years now, which is a shame. I always enjoyed that. And this is what I was talking about here when he destroys the radio. At this point, his motivation is pretty clear. Quint just doesn't want any help. He was hired to kill the shark, and that's what he intends to do. Really, whether he gets the money or not, I think he just wants to kill the damn thing. But later, he he appears to me to be genuinely frightened, and almost frightened, I guess, to the point where he kind of loses it for a second and damages the boat. Unless you're supposed to think he does that on purpose, which I find hard to believe, but that, again, that gets kind of muddy here in a second. Or not a second, in a few minutes. And more barrels. John Williams has talked about composing the music, and you can really hear a little bit of the different tone in the soundtrack here, but it's meant to sound a little bit like a pirate movie, which is how John Williams saw the third act, and that's why the music takes on a little bit of a swashbuckling type sound, and I think it fits great. I don't mean to keep praising John Williams, but if there's anyone that was born to do something that and then ended up doing exactly what they were born to do, it seems to me it was John Williams. Composing music for movies is somehow in his DNA. He's just amazing. There's a great shot here of Brody coming up where he's smiling, and this would be fun at this point, chasing the shark down. Nothing really horrible has happened to them yet, and there's Hooper having a good time, especially knowing the damage this shark has done. He's killed the boy, killed Chrissy, killed Ben Gardner. You would want the shark dead. And I say that I'm a huge animal lover, no matter what the animal is. I don't believe in just haphazardly killing things, but this would be a different situation. Peter Benchley apparently later in life felt very guilty about the results of Jaws and what it did to not just the population of great whites, but the population of sharks in general. People thought after Jaws, well, I can be a big hero and I'll go, catch a lot of these man-eating sharks that are so horrible. And he spent a lot of his time and I'm assuming a lot of his money in conservation efforts trying to help sharks and undo some of the damage that Jaws caused to the shark population, which, more power to him. Peter Benchley, if I remember correctly, he's been dead maybe 10 years, maybe longer than that now at this point. I don't remember that he was very old when he died. And he had some other success with other books. He wrote The Deep, which they turned into a movie just a couple of years after Jaws, and Robert Shaw's in that, and it's a good movie. It's certainly worth watching. I've never read The Deep, the book, and he wrote a few other books after that I know one was turned into a TV movie with Craig T. Nelson, but I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head. It was not, I think because of what he thought about what had happened to the shark population, he kind of created a different sort of creature for the book I'm talking about that I can't remember the name of, and it wasn't a real thing to prevent people going out and killing the real thing. My understanding is something that's coming up right here is when the orca that was not supposed to sink actually sank. When they turn it on its side like that, they ripped something out of the bottom of the boat and it slowly began to sink. And they scrambled to try to get the actors off the boat and to get the sound team off the boat and everyone else that's involved in the production that you can't see that is actually standing on the boat trying to get them off. The film they did not get to in time and was submerged in the water, and they were able to save it. And in the things I've seen, they've acted as if that was a a huge thing to be able to save the film that was in the camera. But I thought, I don't really know how much filming at that point they had accomplished just in a day. I mean, yeah, that would have been a real pain in the ass, especially given what was already going wrong in the production, to lose a day's worth of filming. But it couldn't have been that much footage that would have been lost. But they sent it to the lab, and the film was fine. So, it may be that it was involved in some really elaborate effect, like turning the boat on its side or something, and they just didn't want to do it again. But no one's ever said that. And here we have something that obviously in real life is not realistic at all for a great white shark to be towing a boat like that under its own power. But it's easy to see why at this point all the fun and games are over, and these three guys, including Quint, are scared. They realize at this point what they're up against. Yeah, the idea of being in the water where that thing is furnace. There's a shot right here of Quint sticking his machete into the side of the boat. It's a good shot anyway, no matter what. But it seems to me, and the way Spielberg designs his movies, it looks as if that machete is going to have some sort of significance in something that happens later. Now, Quint does pick it up, and he's stabbing it into the shark later as Quint is being eaten alive, but we don't even see him really get it out of the side of the boat, and it doesn't have much of an impact. You have to look fast to even see that he's got the knife in the shark. In the first draft of the screenplay, however, Peter Benchley had Quint's death exactly as it was in the book, which was he ends up drowning. He gets caught up in one of the ropes that were tied to a barrel and tied to a shark, and the shark drags him underwater and he drowns. And as he's getting dragged underwater, he's pleading with Brody to get the knife, but Brody is caught in the water because at this point the orca is sinking and he can't get to the knife in time to cut Quint loose. And knowing what I know about the production, as far as they were writing and rewriting the script as they were filming the movie, I'm kind of wondering if maybe that was shot before they had changed the ending to Quint getting eaten alive by the shark, and it ended up just being a cool shot. So Spielberg left it in the movie, even though they changed the ending where the knife didn't have any significance. That's complete speculation on my part. I have no idea if that's relevant or not, but it seems like it definitely could be. And this is what I was talking about earlier. To me, Quint's intentions here are not exactly clear. On the one hand, you could say he's doing this to the boat intentionally so that they can't get back. And I could see Quint doing that. Excuse me, this is what happens to your voice when you've been talking almost nonstop for, almost 2 hours now. But it seems to me as if he's genuinely scared and knows that if he doesn't have the boat at full throttle, the shark's going to catch up with him and they're not going to make it. But again, wouldn't Quint know the capabilities of his own boat, and he wouldn't want to do this if he was scared of what was going to happen with the shark? I'm never exactly been clear on what he's thinking here. That's a great shot of the barrels right there. I really like that. And we don't really see a reaction from Quint here. Is he surprised about what's happened to the boat? Is he pleased? How does he feel? That would give us maybe a little bit better indication. But there he's just putting out the fire like it's, and you don't see how he feels about the situation. So you're just left to speculate. That's a great shot of Richard Dreyfuss right there. That's the audience talking. That terror and desperation at this point. And here you do get the sense that Robert Shaw kind of realizes, wow, we're screwed. But he got him to this point, and it's hard to believe it was an accident. Like, he didn't know what was going to happen, but he seems concerned. So, again, I know I'm belaboring the point, but it's always confused me. Wow. They really are. They're in big trouble. And Quint, true to his word, not putting on the life jacket, which I can't say I blame him. If you had to choose between drowning and getting eaten by a shark, I think I'd definitely choose drowning. And I guess this is also supposed to demonstrate how desperate even Quint thinks the situation is, to actually turn to Hooper for his kind of help with these intricate devices and fancy stuff that he does not believe in. But that's where they are at this point. Then he just asked him about getting that needle into the shark's skin. Then why did Hooper even bring it? Even though Hooper didn't understand the true size of the shark at this point, he would have known, I can't get that tiny little needle through a great white skin. So I don't know why that's even, why is that even on the boat? Maybe it just comes as a kit and it all comes together. As I mentioned before, Richard Dreyfuss is not in any of these underwater scenes. It's different people. They used, I think their name is Rob and Valerie Taylor, who were big time shark experts, and they used them to get some footage of some real great whites for certain sequences, especially the one coming up when Hooper goes down in the cage. And one of their ideas at the time, because as far as anyone knows, there's not an actual 25-foot great white, although just a few weeks ago there was one that was either that size or pretty close. But obviously you couldn't count on running into a shark that size. I think the average is about 15 feet. Don't quote me on that, but that's about right. So the idea to kind of match up the scale with the diver in the cage and the sharks that would actually be there was to have a little person in the cage with the equipment on, because you wouldn't be able to tell that it was Richard Dreyfuss. So it's, in some shots it's the little person in the cage. At other times it's someone that was actually in a tank at Universal that was being filmed, and I think some close-ups or even somebody else. And I already mentioned they filmed the part with Ben Gardner's head in Verna Field's pool. So I'd assume whoever you're seeing there from the back as that head pops out is even another person. So there are many different people playing Hooper underwater, and none of them is Richard Dreyfuss. Even when you see the close-ups of his eyes, that's somebody else. Luckily, in all that equipment, you can't tell. See right there, that's not Richard Dreyfuss, but looks like him to me. And this is in the tank at Universal. And that, of course, is a real shark. I promise I won't point out every instance of when when the shark is real and when it's not. They got some excellent footage here coming up when this shark. Now, look, this I'll go back to that in a second. But why in the world would you be holding that stick outside that cage? And there's a little bit of a mistake. The guy filling in for Richard Dreyfuss has his wedding ring on right there, and of course Hooper is not married. But put the stick inside your cage. So of course, what happens? He drops it. I don't know what you were expecting. But the footage here of the shark getting caught in the cage and the ropes between the cage and the boat is excellent. And that was a mistake. A shark in reality, where they were filming the great whites in Australia, genuinely just got caught up in the lines, and they called back to tell Spielberg and the production staff, "Oh, we have this amazing footage of this shark, and he's just taking the cage apart." And they asked if the little person was in the cage, and they had to tell him no. And in the book, Hooper dies right here. The jaws actually reach him, and it's one of the best parts of the book, describing what's going on here from Hooper's point of view, and when he realizes that the jaws are going to reach him, and what he sees and feels as the shark bites into him. It's really terrifying. But supposedly they were going to have Hooper die like in the book. The shark was really gonna latch onto him right here and take him out of the cage, and he was going to die. And here's the shots I'm talking about, with the shark just going crazy on top of this cage. But because the little person was not in the cage at the time, this footage, they got this footage of the shark taking the cage apart. They decided, well, we'll have to let Hooper swim out of the cage, and he'll have to survive. I kind of find that a little bit hard to swallow. It would have been a completely different ending, or feel like a different ending to the movie, if Hooper had been killed. Because at this point, the movie is really more of an adventure story than a horror story or a gritty, realistic man-nature thing. So I don't, I do understand, well, Hooper dies in the book, so he would die in the movie, but I don't know. I've never heard it actually confirmed from Spielberg that they were going to have Hooper die right there, but maybe that's the true story. And here we go. Here's the last, Quint's last stand, or his last fall, I guess. And this really is horrifying, and they were definitely correct in having the shark actually eat Quint. For one thing, this is the only time you really see the shark with someone in his mouth like this. All the other deaths have been off screen or implied, or you've kind of seen the aftermath. You've never really gotten to see the shark really bite into somebody, but boy, you get to see it right here. I remember when this used to come on television before my family had a VCR, they would really, for obvious reasons, edit the hell out of that scene where Quint gets eaten. It would last about 3 seconds. And this is amazing too. The shark looks so real right here. And Jaws 2, Jaws 3, Jaws the Revenge, after they had worked with the shark enough to get it to operate in better ways, and they had learned a lot about how to use paint and other things to make it look more realistic. It never looked as real in any other movie as it does in this one, when it would barely function, and that's obviously all Steven Spielberg's doing it, knowing when to use the shark, how to use it, and when to show it and when not to show it. And and it's what makes the movie work. And this does lend some credence to letting the idea that they were going to let Hooper die, because during this entire thing, Hooper is obviously just hiding out on the bottom. So it in some ways doesn't make a lot of sense that he'd just be hanging out down there. So of course, if he had been killed in the cage, you wouldn't have to worry about explaining that he's hiding out on the bottom. It would just be Brody versus the shark. And this is what needs to happen for the sake of the movie. It's Brody and the shark, even though I still stick to my guns about the third act pretty much being Quint's movie, or at least Quint's part of the movie. It needed to come down to Brody and the shark. I did see this in the theater, but I was too young to remember this ending. I would have loved to have seen this with a hyped up audience when this first premiered in theaters, to hear their reaction when he finally shoots and kills the shark. The excitement and the pure elation of that moment must have been incredible. Must have been exactly like that, which is why I think that's the perfect way for Roy Scheider to react. And there's what's left of the shark. There's a little bit of a sound taken from a television movie that Spielberg made a few years before Jaws, called Duel, about a monster tractor trailer truck that starts terrorizing just a everyday guy on the highways. And at the end, I haven't seen the movie in a long time, but if I remember correctly, the tractor trailer, the evil truck, ends up going over a cliff, and there's a sound that emanates from the truck as it's going over, that Spielberg kind of added to the sound of the shark sinking, because he felt that the two movies really had a lot in common as far as themes of man versus some unstoppable force. I thought that was a nice touch, just a personal thing on Spielberg's part, but he, after doing what he did to pull this movie off, he deserved it. That response, no, when Hooper asks about Quint, is perfect too. It's all Hooper needs to know. If you're going to have Hooper survive, he has to ask about Quint, obviously, and that's all he needs to hear. Don't need to go into a bunch of detail about it, because at this point, what does it matter? And here, if Brody had survived on his own, I guess the rest of the movie would have just been silent. It would have shown Brody kind of getting on the same contraption that it shows him and Hooper on there, and making his way back to shore all on his own, without this, these little bits of conversation, which I just don't think would have been as strong a way to end the movie, with the two survivors, the two friends now making their way back to shore. And I have watched these credits all the way through, and they end right as Brody and Hooper do make it back to the beach, which I thought was a nice touch. But there is my commentary for Jaws. As I mentioned, it's one of my favorite films. It completely changed the way the film business works, especially in the summer, and it's hard to find a better movie, in my opinion. It is absolutely fantastic. I haven't really decided what movie I'm going to do next. I was thinking about getting into some James Bond, maybe doing a James Bond film that I don't particularly find that great, even though I'm a James Bond fan. Obviously, not all the movies are fantastic, but if you have any other suggestions, feel free to leave me a comment, or if you have anything else to add that you know about Jaws, feel free to do that as well, and I will see you next time. Thanks for listening.